Today I'm going to discuss the most important chapter is translation of poetry. Those students who are pursuing BA program English A course, second year and third year is the optional subject translation and as well as the English honor students translation of poetry. Translation of poetry, this topic is repeated in your examinations papers again and again. That's why I'm discussing with you. Translation of poetry is probably the subject in the translation studies that triggers the strongest polemic. Even those not specialized in translation often have an opinion on the subject. There are five types of translations. So there are five types of translation. How the translation of poetry and जो whole process है, now I'm going to discuss with you which kind of a whole process of translation of poetry. Direct access to the original. So what is the original poetry? We target the direct material, we target the direct lines. Most probably the form of translation is metatextual and consisted in critical apparatus prepared for a poem in the same language of a poem or in the another language, allowing people not particularly proficient in that language to assess and interpretations of the text. So direct access to the original text is all about how we target the all the poetry beautiful lines, and most probably the form of translation is metatextual and consisted in a critical apparatus prepared for a poem. ठीक है. Metatextual. So though there are so many tasks consists in a critical apparatus prepared for a poem. So here we have a critical opinions of about the poems and poems lines also in the same language of a poem or in the another language. So there are lots of critics available about all the poems you have in your subjects, and critics are describing which kind of a technique and literary tech devices are used in the poem, and we have already discussed about it. So critics are doing this kind of a work. Critics who are belonging to the same language as well as who are the um, from the another language, they translate it in the same manner and critique about it, allowing people not particularly proficient in that language to assess an interpretation of the text. So, by the critics' help, those people who are belonging to the another language, they can also interpret the whole text easily. Now we have a next point: interlinear translation with parallel text. This is the another form of direct access to the original, but in this case, the aid is textual and metatextual. Interlinear translation with parallel text. Interlinear means line to line. Parallel मतलब साथ के साथ. This is the another form of direct access to the original text. While we are translate the line parallelly, interlinear way is called the interlinear translation with the parallel text. But in this case, the aid is textual or metatextual. Philological translation. A translation that doesn't consider the readability of the text that is produced. Its philological adherence to the proto-text only. The aim of such a translation is to give access to the original for readers unable to access it through one of the day previous tragedies. Philological translation is all about a translation that does not consider the readability of text that is produced. It is philological adherence to the proto-text only. The aim of such a translation is to give access to the original for readers unable to access it through one of the previous strategies. So those readers who are not capable to access the direct line original material, so this kind of a philological translation will help them to understand what is the actual meaning of the text and what is the actual beautiful form and literary device have used in this kind of a poem line by line. Single dominant translation, usually the result of a poor and superficial analysis of prototext or of the insufficient poetic competence of low profile publishing policy. Single dominant translation, usually the result of a poor and superficial analysis of the prototext of insufficient poetic competence of low profile publishing policy. So, when we try to understand a meaning of a poem by a single reading, by a single uh, touch, so this kind of a single dominant translation process is also helpful in the translation of poetry. Translation with a hierarchy of dominant and subdominant. This is the method that, while seeking an equilibrium between the opposite extremes of transability, takes for the granted the impossibility to translate everything. Translation with a hierarchy of dominant and subdominant. This is the method that, while seeking an equilibrium means while we try to make it equally beautiful translation between the opposite extremes, those uh, those words who are belonging to each other as a opposite meaning of transability takes for the granted the impossibility to translate everything. So this kind of a things and this kind of a process is also happening while we translate a poetry. So here we have a conclusion. Translation of poetry is popularly the subject in the translation studies that triggers the strongest polemics. Even those not specialized in translation often have an opinion on the subject. So those people who are belonging to the other language, mm, like critics, for example, critics are who are the reader and who describe the techniques and literary devices of the poem which are used by the other writers, though we are called them in the literary language critics. So those have also some kind of a opinion about each and every poetry. So this kind of a translation of poetry process will definitely help them to understand what is the actual literary devices have used by the other writers and how the beautiful meanings come by the reading twicely. Sometimes the reader try to understand the poem once reading, which is not a good understanding, which is not enough capable to give you a beautiful meaning and what is the actual meaning of the poem. So that's why we have to read the poetry twicely, thricely, and four times also in order to understand it in a very proper way, in a good meaning. So the question is coming in your exam, what is the process of translation of poetry? It will comes in 100 to 250 words, 25 marks, and you have to follow the same structure. First of all, you have to give the introduction. Translation of poetry is probably the subject in the translation studies that trigger the strongest polemics. Even those not specialized in the translation often have an opinion on the subject. There are five types of translations. First of all, direct access to the original. ठीक है. Next is interlinear translation with a parallel text. Philological translation, a translation that does not consider the readability of the text that is produced and is philological adherence to the proto-text only. Single dominant translation, usually the result of a poor and superficial analysis of the proto-text or insufficient poetic competence or low profile publishing policy. The next one is translation with a hierarchy of dominant and subdominant. This is a method that, while seeking an equilibrium between the opposite extremes of transcriptability, takes for the granted and the impossibility of translate everything. So, in the poetry, sometimes this kind of a thing happening. The poet have and the writer have used the and really heresy and like hyperbolic words which is not easily to understand by the readers who are belonging to the other language. So this kind of a difficulties have come while we try to translate the poetry. So I hope you like this video, which is very important according to your examination point of view. You have to write all the points as I have discussed with you. Thank you so much.